And recording has started. So good afternoon. This is David Perlman, and I'm going to say Deb. I think you went on mute already from SUNY
Deb
Oneonta.
McLennan.
Go ahead, Deb. Say hello.
This is Deb McLennan from SUNY Oneonta.
Excellent. My co-host for the week. And this is MS Office Hours. Today is September 24th. With us this afternoon is Justin from CoreBts, and we're going to be taking part in the second portion of our Power Automate use cases, and we're going to get into the weeds a little bit today, I hear, Justin. So it's all yours.
Yes, we are. Thank you so much, Dave. So last week,
Appreciate it.
of course. So last week when we talked, we went over sort of at a high level what Power Automate AI Builder is and really like the core functionality of that. Throughout the last couple of weeks, we've really been talking about how it can be used within the education space, some different possible use cases, how the functionality works, how the UI looks, all of those pieces. And today, as David said, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into another use case and sort of explore how all of the different pieces connect together. The example I'll give today, and I have a one slide that I'll show you all before jumping right into it. We'll sort of describe what that use case is. It will be a little bit simplified from when we've done it before, but in order to keep it within our time frame, taking a couple pieces off. But I'll talk to sort of all the core pieces of that. But for today, what the use case that we'll be covering is sort of an example of how you can take Power Automate AI Builder and really leverage it amongst a bunch of different solutions, and surface that in many different ways to help sort of provide insights maybe to professors, to students, to really anyone who wants to sort of help answer questions better. So this this use case we have here, for an example, take it at the class or the course level, to simplify it. What we want to do is, of course, in classes, you have students that have many questions. They have questions throughout the entire course. They have questions on a given day, but they have a lot of questions, and typically, they're around the curriculum that you're teaching to, right? Because that's sort of that education sort of experience. And what you'll find is when you're working in a course, a professor's probably a lot of the time answering a lot of the same questions, but those questions are being answered in a lot of different ways. So what we wanted to do was take all of this sort of input of questions from students and start to actually aggregate them, and then from there be able to sort of provide contextual insights from them using things like Power BI and showcasing that on SharePoint or Microsoft Teams. And what we do here and what we do in this use case, I'll walk through, but it's on the screen, is basically we put together a SharePoint page that embeds a Power App that can be sort of a form, or a question form. Say a student has a question, they want to ask a teacher or professor or what have you. We then take all of those questions and store them in the common data service within Office 365. If you're not familiar with the common data service, it's essentially an entity style storage framework that allows you to store many different types of data within your Office 365 tenant and then leverage it across that in many different ways as well. But we take the Power Apps form where we have questions, we store them within the common data service, and then we actually report on them in Power BI to see what types of questions are sort of coming up. And when you sort of get questions from students, really what they're asking you is just a question. You really can't, unless you read the full question, you can't really understand what that question is about really quickly, and it's really hard to sort of data and know what topics students, for example, are asking on a given course. So what we can do, leveraging Power Automate and the AI Builder, is with this amount of these questions that we store through this form, we can begin to build an AI model that stores all these questions, tags the questions with different topics. For example, I'll use Power Apps as one, and that's actually what we use in the example in the demo. We can say, how do I add a custom connection? The topic for that might be connections versus something where we say, How do I import a custom connect? How do I use a custom connection in let's say, a model-driven app? And then topics for that would be like model-driven and connections. And what this allows us to do is sort of aggregate, understand what types of questions are being asked, and then from there, provide targeted sort of reviews or sessions with students where you're asking questions that you know are being asked the most, because you can target the time you have with your students, because there might be hundreds of questions, but you want to make sure that you get to the most important ones. So what we do here is in the top, like I said, we have the Power App, which helps us get questions in. We have the Power BI report that reports on the common data service data. But in order to get that information and sort of leverage the AI builder, we have a flow, which anytime a student creates or adds a new question, it adds that as a new record in the common data service. It then looks at that question based off of a AI model that we put together. It understands, okay, this is the topic that this question pertains to. It then gets all those tags and all those topics, iterates through that, and uploads that as a string on a property on that same record we just created. And then that flow goes ahead and refreshes the data set in Power BI, so that when a professor goes and wants to go and see what questions do I have, they can see what questions that are there, and then also see the frequency of those questions. Like I said, to maybe target the class or target the session a little bit better. So I know there's a lot here, and there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle here. I'll focus mostly on sort of the Power Automate pieces, but I will touch on how it sort of surfaces in the other tools. But at any time when I go into this demo, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know, and if I can answer it quickly, we can do that, or we can just wait until the end as well. So before I get started, any questions on the overall use case?
There was some question on cost, and we're not going to get into that too much today. But yeah, some of the pieces, depending on what you're doing in Azure or how you're answering some of those questions, I guess it's relative, right? If you're teaching a very large scale online class, it can take up a lot of energy and people time as well, trying to answer questions as well. Looks like Maitri, you have a question as well. You had your hand raised.
Yes, I have. Most probably this is a stupid question, just because it's a brand new AI for the Power Automate. Small question. When you tell whenever you gave an example, right? When the question is stored in CDS, so does this AI scan once again everything, or only the new one added?
So how this works is, and I'll actually walk through this, is questions, how it gets tagged is actually when it's created, and the flow is doing that. We're doing it when a new record is added.
Mm-hmm.
What you're adding in is just the question, really. You're saying, how do I add a connection to a Power App? What happens is the flow takes that record, gets the text from that record, runs it through this AI model that has been created. That AI model returns back the tags, and then we add those tags directly to that same row and refresh the data set. So that's all happening basically real time on submission. And what's great about that with AI Builder is that it's constantly learning from itself. So as new questions get added down the road, this is something that can not just exist for one course, for like one instance of a course. Curriculum for courses, they change obviously between semester to semester, but a lot of the topics stay the same. So this could be something that is used across semesters, where you have the same questions over the course of time, and you're sort of understanding more and more what students are having questions on. Answer, like I said, directly, it gets evaluated when the question is submitted.
And this CDS stores like it has any time limit? It stores for this much of time, or
no? So it stores in CDS indefinitely.
okay, thank you.
Great.
I'll break away from that. Can you all see my screen still?
Yes.
Perfect. So what you'll see here is sort of where we're getting to, as sort of the simple, and I'll walk through the different pieces of this puzzle on how we got here. But as a general example, this is just a SharePoint site with a SharePoint page. We have a Power BI report that sort of shows the different questions that have been asked, and sort of a little bar chart that sort of helps us understand maybe the different topics that are asked the most, as well as a Power App, which allows us to sort of input questions. Just to show this in sort of in function right now, we can see here we have 11 questions on connections. I can click on that, and what's nice about that is that I also have sort of a data table here that shows those questions, so I can see these are all the questions I received regarding connections. I can switch it to like model-driven apps or Canvas apps or those different things, and I can see with that information. Honestly, the Power BI piece you could really do a lot with, but as a general example, this shows us that using the common data service, we can call that same data set that we're going to show in Power BI that we're then connecting to and submitting to with a Power App that we then leverage in the AI builder to build our model. So ultimately, the professor could come in and say, "Oh, I have this many questions on connections, and they're all about how do I create them." So then I could get that. But say I'm a student and I want to add a connection or add a question, and I'm curious to know that detail. So let's say, how do I add connections to, let's say, Canvas apps? So I can submit this, and we'll come back to this in a second. But what this is going to allow us to do is see that data here, and then from there get the tags on it. So just to jump from this as well, this is something that you could very easily embed in a team. This doesn't have to just be in SharePoint. You can embed SharePoint pages inside a team. So again, another layer deep. But when you build out sort of this whole process, the first thing that you have to start with is your data. When you want to sort of put this together, the core thing when you think of the common data service is you need sort of your schema and your data that you need to analyze on. This is an example of some of these connection questions. All the data that I really submitted for this model, and I'll show putting that in, is three things, right? One, I just have an ID field. This allows me to just have a unique field. It's a requirement of an entity. I also give the actual tag myself manually, and then sort of a list of different questions. Now, what I can do with that is, say I have an entity, which I have here in the common data service called course questions. I can click on that, and then I can actually automatically pull in this data that I have in Excel, and I've already done it, so I'm not going to go through the full process, but I can click data here. And what's nice is that this is going to allow me to get data from many different places. I can pull it from Excel. I can pull it from a text CSV. There's a lot of connections that are just available through Power Query. And you can see here, this is actually Power Query in the backend. But I would click text CSV. I then can browse through OneDrive. It then is going to authenticate the OneDrive and pull you to your OneDrive. We can see here, I do have an example of that file. I can click next. And that's going to go through and start to understand what sort of data I have. It can identify that I have those three fields. You go through here, you go click on transform data. This is where if you need to transform the data, say you have like concatenation and you want to split those columns out. This is some interface that you've probably seen in Power Query and Power BI if you used it for. And then you click next, and it will go and upload that data to your entity. But since I already created that, I'll just show you here. We see that if I go, we have course questions. If I wanted to see data, I can click on data within the data that service, and I can see all these different connections questions that I also entered. So that's great. The first thing you need to have is have data for your model to actually do something. From there, we have AI Builder. Now, we talked about this a little bit last time, but the key thing with AI Builder is that you have to have data to work with. So if we look at our models that we have now, I created what's called a course question tagging model. What's nice about this is when you create a model, you can update that same model repeatedly and sort of retrain it time and time after again to sort of help it get better at sort of its prediction and its intelligence. So if you click on a model, once you have one live, it does give you a little KPI indicator here to say like what's its score on how well it predicts sort of and gives information back from the AI. When you do train something, you also have the ability to test. So for example, how do I add connections? Test this. And then you can see here, oh, that's definitely a connections question, 99%. How do I create a, let's say a Canvas app? And I click test here. We're going to see here, oh, this is a Canvas app. It gets tagged as a Canvas app. So to show how this really gets trained, it's a pretty simple process. I'll click on Edit Model, and we'll go back into this. And what happens here is that if I click Select Text, I get to pick my entity. So I pick Course Questions. That's my entity in the Common Data Service. And then it's asking me to pick the field that I'm going to be evaluating every time against this model. That's going to be the text field. From there, I need to select my tags. So what are my tags within the entity itself? So you click Select Tags, and I already have it selected, but you would click Tags here. And then it's going to ask you, okay, for that field you have in that in the Common Data Service, how are they separated? For the most part in this, they're separated by semicolons. So I'm going to click semicolon. Then it's going to give me a couple of examples where it's identified some tags with some text. I could review those and confirm if it's what I expect. Then I click next. It asks you for your language. And then you click train. And now what this will do, and this will take some time, but it allows you to go back to the details page. And you can see if I go, I'm going to see that this model is retraining, because I did train it before. We want to get it intelligent. And so what we'll see here is that that is being retrained. So while that's working, I will show you some of the other pieces on pulling in the Common Data Service to sort of pull in that same data. So once this is training, the Power Apps piece of it's pretty simple. To add data from the Common Data Service, if you are in Power Apps and you're creating a Power App in Power App Studios or Power App Studio, data, the Common Data Service is like the most default sort of data that Power Apps can consume. So typically what you'll see is that if you go into your data section, you'll see all the entities that you're working with. On the back end, this is actually called healthcare feedbacks, because I used this for a different example before. But this is our entity that we're using for the questions. So you just click that, and we can see here that we have sort of this form. And if we click on the form, we'll see that this is pulling from that same entity. So now I just basically have this, what is the question? I have an ID field here. Typically you would increment that on the back end and not show it to the user for the simplicity of the demo. I just have that here. And then on your submit button, you're just submitting and then resetting the form. From here, you also have the ability to connect to the Common Data Service via Power BI. That's also pretty simple. If you want to do that in Power BI, there's a Common Data Service connector. So if I pull this in, and it's already pulled in, so it might yell at me, but you just click Common Data Service. And then this asks you for your URL. This URL is a little, I wouldn't say tricky to get, but it's never necessarily in a obvious spot. But if you go into your Power Apps area in your solutions and you click on the gear and then click on advanced settings, this URL that loads is the URL you want. Once you have this URL, you can input this into Power BI. And then in Power BI, you'll then get these same fields. So you can see here, I have the fields for tags and text and those different things. And I added them as a bar chart. And then I also added a table to sort of see those different questions. And you can see here the questions with the text and then also the tags where the model went in and tagged that question, as well as the different form to see the different amounts of questions given a different topic. So from there, that's great. I'm able to show sort of my data, show the questions that are coming in, but I want to be able to sort of automate the process of adding questions and then them automatically getting sort of evaluated by the model, updated in the common data service, and then refreshing that data set in Power BI so that ultimately the user can leverage it. For that, we use Power Automate, right? So in Power Automate, pretty simple process. We can say, hey, let me actually go into edit view of this. We could say, hey, when a record is created in this entity, like I mentioned, this healthcare entity is our questions entity. At a scope of the organization, I want you to take that text and I want you to classify it giving one of my custom models. Once you publish your model here, if I click on this, it's published now, so I can't publish it again. But once this finally finishes training, I can publish that new model, and a publish button will show up here. Once that's published, it'll show up in Power Automate. You just select it from the dropdown. You then select your text from this record. So this is pulling from this record as created action. I then create a variable because what I want to do is when you get results, it's going to bring back sort of multiple tags if it meets multiple topics. I want to take those tags, iterate over that sort of list of tags, and put it into one string so I can put it back into that same row. So I create a classification. I then take those results from that model evaluation, append basically that classification with a semicolon repeatedly to get those classifications, then update that record. So basically, I'm going to take in that ID from this initial action on that same entity, and then I'm going to just put in my classifications string back into that row. Another thing I can add, as I mentioned, is maybe we want to refresh the data set. One thing I'll say with this is that you typically wouldn't do it in this way because there are limits to how many times you can refresh a data set in a given 24-hour period with given licensing. But maybe this is something you do maybe nightly. But you could say refresh a data set, and I'm just going to pick my workspace. And then the data set and click save. And so now I actually want to test that. So let's go through, and I'm actually going to use the test functionality in Microsoft Flow and say I'll perform the trigger action. This is going to go wait. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to just add in question and say, how do I create or add new Canvas apps? I'll submit that question. We can see here that the flow has now picked that up, that I've created a new record with the common data service. It's going to take its time to load. You can see here that we got the confirmation that it ran successfully, so it's going to continue loading just to give us sort of the output of all those pieces. And in the meantime, while that's running, what I can do is let me unselect this and refresh this page. And we're going to see this 956 that I just added. How do I create or add new Canvas apps? We can see here that the tag came in and added Canvas apps and model driven as possible tags on that question. So now if I go back and I check on this run, let me actually just do this because sometimes the reload helps that a little bit better. I can click on this and we can see here that we had the record that was created. How do I create new apps? We then use our model to evaluate the results. We can see here that it has different percentages. It does have a higher percentage for Canvas apps over model-driven apps. We then created that variable, iterated over those different options. We can see here that Canvas apps, again, was the first one. We updated that record in the common data service, and then we refreshed that data set in Power BI. And ultimately, we get back to a situation where, like I said, you could see the different questions that are being asked. This is something that could be over, say, a given course, a class, multiple iterations of the course. And really, the possibilities are endless for this. Like I said, this is a little bit oversimplified version. But what you can do with this, you could show it in Teams. You could get questions based off of even maybe the user that's asking the questions based off of time. You could do things where you could take this and then also use the predict AI builder module that we talked about last week and say, hey, when you have so many questions given before a test, it's usually that the performance is low. Do you want to review these types of topics? You really have a lot of flexibility in what you can do with it, and you're really only limited, I would say, by your creativity. But that's all I had to show, and I know we're getting a little close on time. But as a review, what we showed was basically that we can take take a SharePoint page, put a Power Apps form on top of that with a Power BI report, store different data within the common data service. Then using Power Automate, when we create new records via that Power Apps, we can use AI Builder and a model that we built out to sort of detect different topics and themes in the same questions, append that and sort of iterate over that so we can put it back into that same model and then refresh that data set and surface it in any way we need, like I said, in SharePoint or Teams. So I know I covered a lot really quick there, so wanted to take a couple seconds to see if there are any questions regarding anything I showed.
Absolutely. We'll give it a minute for anybody from the audience if you'd like, either in the text or I have one or two questions I can add if nobody asks anything. So feel free to raise your hand. Well, you can come off mute. So there's a lot in there, right, Justin? I mean, really appreciate you going through this. So if anybody's seen Dr. Kellerman, professor in Australia, they've taken this a little further even in some of his demos in terms of kind of some of the course syllabus stuff that they've been doing in the Q&A. Where have you used this in your, in some of the consulting you folks are doing?
Yeah, so
some examples.
Yeah, so in terms of the education space, I think it's always a little challenging to understand like what audience you want to target, right? Because within the education space, you have students, you have faculty, and you have administration. And I think this can be used in many different ways for that. I think to be more sort of empathetic of sort of the student and professor relationship, I think this sort of being able to say, hey, we have sort of maybe at large scale universities, we have sort of this curriculum that has these topics that we sort of provide to our students year over year over year over year. Yes, they change and they sort of develop over time, that curriculum, but a lot of times we're covering the same detail. So what's nice about this is something like this, as an example, is something that could really be used in long term. This isn't one that we are actively using, but it could be. Things that we've done before with students or with universities, it's really around approvals or forms processing. So a lot of times we have we actually worked with a university that did forms processing for sort of admissions paperwork. We also had one that did it for sort of the capstone thesis piece where a student has to go through so many different steps. I think we talked about that either last week or the week before, where when you do a thesis project, you have your justifications and you have your papers and you have all these different pieces, and being able to track that process is something that Power Automate is actually pretty effective at doing. And so that's one we've actually done with a customer before. Awesome. But really, AI Builder, like I said, is it's a newer. We all know it's newer in this space, and because of how powerful it is, you really can do many different things. But that's one example. I would say most of the time it's around forms processing if we're using AI Builder.
Great. No, I think seeing a lot of different tools here, right? And I don't spend as much as as much of my time. I've done some basic Q&A chatbot kind of stuff, right? And this is taking that even further, right? So possibilities for course syllabus, for folks that are You mentioned, I think everybody's learning how to be a better remote learner these days, right? So almost every school now has that 100 level course or even the graduate level course. You need to take this half credit course on how to be a good remote learner. And there may, some common questions that come up, and it might even be a good way to measure sentiment, right? When it comes to how are our students engaging, where are they engaging, what is that thought process? And so I know there's some folks that are using some of these tools, actually looking at predictive analytics, which again is way past what we're going to deal with in this group, but really appreciate it. So I think, Justin, thank you very much. I'm going to stop recording here real quick, and then we'll talk real quickly about what we have going on. So thank you so much. That was,
Of course.
it was very insightful for me, and I know for a lot of the folks on the call, and the fact that we don't have tons of questions had more to do with